Hello everyone. This video is a redo of a video that I had posted that somehow something happened to my YouTube account and some of the videos were deleted. So I'm recording another one for folks that weren't able to see it. But mainly the big thing here is this idea I want to talk about is that we're writing a longer essay. And I waited a week before I posted this because I wanted folks to really kind of think, work, and write through their paper, because typically what I've been seeing with folks is they're kind of sticking to that traditional typical essay in which you have your standard introduction that kind of hooks the reader, some series of body paragraphs, especially as I've been meeting with folks and having great ideas in their drafts, but also thinking about how to kind of really stretch those ideas, right? So the traditional paragraph has your introduction, handful of body paragraphs, a conclusion. But one of the kind of things that we also think about is that we think that in a typical essay is that your audience has read the topic and has a general sense of your argument from the introduction. And then we kind of give shorter type paragraphs, right? So that's kind of that traditional way. But what I want to kind of talk about is really this analogy between a short essay, which would be like a movie, and a longer essay that we're working on, like a TV show, right? So in a traditional essay, you have the traditional introduction, you kind of move quickly, you have a handful of body paragraphs, and then you kind of try to wrap it up. Whereas in a longer essay, like a TV series, you're stretching it out, you're planting seeds, you're developing a more in-depth way of looking at your thesis and showing how you're building that argument. That's why folks have had almost like 2 weeks to work on this. So with the longer essay, your introduction could be about a page, and it's going to be multiple paragraphs, because this idea is that it's still going to have a thesis that can be more complex, that could be maybe a few more sentences. So for example, these bullet points here are paragraphs within the introduction, if that makes sense. And I'm going to model. I've been meeting with folks, and I've been using the model the outline that I pretend George the student was doing for this paper. Once again, same thing. When I talk about body paragraphs, or I talk about body sections of an essay, I'm talking about topics. I call them buckets. That way, for example, you might spend 2 pages on a body section, and that's what these bullet points are looking at. And folks, I'm not trying to confuse you, just different ways to unpack the layers of a deep, longer essay. So this is just showing you some different ways to approach it. So even like this idea, so your general approach to the longer essay is thinking about what specific evidence are needed for your audience to believe your argument. So in my sample, I'm going to talk about my body paragraphs, or paragraphs within my introduction, are going to kind of have this kind of tone, because my sample is going to cover the lynching of Drew Benson and on being crazy. Then once again, those body paragraphs really flush out, and the key thing is do this deeper dive and really leaning on the composition toolbox in your paragraph construction, so that not only are you making claims and looking at textual evidence, but you're justifying your claim. As you're presenting evidence, you're interpreting your evidence. Sometimes that's where a source can come in. Especially with your sources, I'll talk about in a little bit, there could be a variety of sources. So really kind of like the takeaways is that your sections are going to be a little more complex, a little bit deep. So I'm going to model an outline for everyone. So as I've been meeting with folks, some folks have a full-blown rough draft. Some people are kind of like in between drafty and kind of outliney. So the reason why I waited to turn this on, so hopefully most of the class was able to watch this video when I turned it on back on Sunday the 5th. But here it is the 9th, and I'm posting a rebroadcast because I think yesterday, the Wednesday the 8th, something happened with my YouTube. Anyways, so even thinking building from the scratch outline, and like I was saying, is your introduction could be a whole page. And this is a little symbol that represents paragraphs. So since I'm using these 2 readings, and especially the turn of the century, if you remember our discussions, so what I want to plant the seed in my reader is this idea about Jim Crow. I want to talk about this idea about the cultural significance of the Great Migration. which is really growing the United States. I mean, this is a pivotal point in American history, and literature and Black literature is at the forefront of it. And then here's where students have been asking me, this isn't a paper on Dunbar and Du Bois, right? So you don't want to pull all kinds, you don't want to go for days talking about Dunbar. Well, you won't be, but George the student doesn't want to talk about Dunbar and Du Bois. That's not what the task. If you go back to the prompt, the task is to pick two stories to have, and then you're arguing a central theme in the two stories. And you're leaning on textual evidence. You're analyzing using the literary tools. So here's my working thesis. And we've been talking about a working thesis has two moving parts. It's the subject, highlighted here in yellow, and then you, the writer, what is your attitude or reaction about the subject? Here is my teal. So this idea that I'm saying is that even though in American literature, these Black writers were forced to grapple with, after the Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that freed slaves during the Civil War. But even ever since that moment, George the student is saying that's the subject of a false sense of civil liberties. And civil liberties are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. These are our civil liberties. And then what I'm saying from a literary lens, my attitude or reaction is I'm saying that both of these writers had a different literary approach, that they used different elements of literature than their white counterparts to illustrate. And I'm saying at the turn of the century, right, because at this time, the implicit, which was, remember on Being Crazy, it was kind of really hard to pin down, and explicit, which was crystal clear in Jude Benson, about social control. So that's really my theme, is about social control. So then, as you're building your body or your topic or your sections, however you want to look at it, you want to give some sort of historical and cultural context. So for me, George the student, I'm going to spend about 2 pages because I want to talk about the Supreme Court said it was okay to have Jim Crow, which to me is a paradox. It's an oxymoron. It conflicts with the Bill of Rights as George the student. Then I want to talk about maybe some publication, maybe I want to meet with one of the librarians about what's happening at the time from the audience lens. But also I'm going to use the CBLs and then talk about this idea of this new renaissance, this new birth. But every time you're constantly thinking about in different sections of your paper and throughout your whole essay, this is what separates a high pass from a pass, is you're really looking at the so what and leaning on that paragraph structure in the toolbox, in the composition toolbox. So you're just not summarizing. You're just not telling your reader. You're showing your reader. Then really topic 2 is really going to be the super meat of my paper, George the student's paper, where I'm probably going to spend about 4 pages on it. Even though I want to talk about the plot and the setting, I would argue that for most of what we're working on in this paper is that you can lean on symbolism, you can lean on metaphors and figurative language, you can lean on imagery, and you can lean on the layers of character conflict within the short stories, because these writers are giving characters agency in all of these stories. And in the literary toolbox, I talk about the different levels of character conflict. Sometimes it's with self, sometimes it's with a person to person, sometimes with society, sometimes it's within nature. But most likely for our readings, it's either going to be person to person, person to self, person to society, and really unpack that. So here I'm even saying, okay, I'm going to talk to Christina, and really this idea where I'm talking about those 4 encounters is maybe I'm going to talk about my article that I find has nothing to do with literature, and it has to do with upholding Jim Crow laws. And really that's kind of the implicit control of denying basic human needs for Du Bois and On Being Crazy. And I want to flush that out. Once again, this is where I'm constantly asking myself as a student, what is my so what? And really pushing that throughout all these different sections within this major topic that I'm going to spend 4 pages on. Hopefully this is making sense. And then everyone's ideas are going to be different, but I'm just kind of showing that, especially since my topic is looking at those two early readings, is this idea, this impact on the reader at the time and future writers. And really, I think it's important that I want to look at is really kind of talk about that movement, that the impact on the reader at the turn of the century, whether you're white, brown, black, purple, green, whatever you were, what that impact was on how you were processing, whether you were in the deep Jim Crow South or you were in the Jim Crow North, whether regardless of your social classes, like how you were relating to these stories. But then also how that kind of inspired some of these other movements in literature that we see throughout the canon that I'm sharing with folks. And then once again, your conclusion can also be a page, and I talk about in the toolbox about this idea of your last opportunity to influence and persuade, and your opportunity to leave kind of like your mic drop, which AKA means that you bring closure to your paper without closing off the topic. All right, folks, get after it.